am CSK and I'm about to pronounce a lot of researchers' names very poorly. Before we get into exact theories behind evolutionary psychology, it's important to ask, why is it different than other types of psychology? Primarily, the difference lies in the definitions and answers it tackles. Peisela's 1998 article discussed Tim Bergen's 4 whys, basically asking why do animals behave the way they do. 2 of these explanations are particularly important to evolutionary psychology, but I will start with the 2 explanations that are the focus of other types of psychology. The first explanation is causation. What internal factors and external factors come together to cause a behavior. Imagine you have your iPhone and someone doesn't know what it is. They come up to you and ask you how it works. Explaining using the causation method, you would say it's a bunch of microchips and wires that make it do what it does. And then you would explain how the small Apple logo makes it better than all other phones. The second explanation of a behavior is development. How do these behaviors change over time? What happens when I download a new software on my phone? It runs faster. It's those behaviors that change over the lifetime of the animal. The next 2 explanations are the focus of evolutionary psychology, that being why behaviors exist and where those behaviors came from. The third explanation is survival value. What's the point of the wires and microchips within my iPhone? What function do they play? Why do we have reflexes? Well, they're positive. They help us survive, so we have them. So then, what's the point of depression? It's a horrible state of mind that not only decreases productivity, but reproductivity, which is the evolutionary point of living. In a 1998 article, Gilbert talked about depression as a way of keeping us from losing again. When we lose, we get put into a depressive state, which makes us not want to compete again. This will stop us from losing more resources or more status. In a more modern study, Anders suggests that depression exists because it helps us protect our immune system. So when our immune system is low, we become depressed and we socially withdraw. We can't get sick when we're not around people. Just like an antivirus on your computer, it may make the system run slower, but it protects you from viruses. Except for Norton, which makes your computer run so slow you can't use it. The final explanation of behavior is evolutionary history. How do behaviors change from generation to generation? Why do changes occur not only in the software of an iPhone, but from iPhone to iPhone? It's because it's becoming more suited to what we need, which I'll touch on later. So there are Tim Bergen's 4 whys of behavior. So now it's important to discuss how evolutionary psychology came to exist. First off, I'd like to mention that Charles Darwin didn't come up with evolution. He came up with natural selection. They're often used interchangeably, but there was actually many theories of evolution before Charles was around. Yeah, we're on a first name basis. In Marshall's 1929 article, he discussed Lamarckian evolution, which is an individual changing over their lifetime and passing on those changes to their offspring. Over enough generations, these small changes would grow and grow and eventually cause large adaptations. In this way, the changes are coming from the individual and not the species, which is a principle of natural selection. For example, imagine a giraffe. He's rolling around being all giraffe-like, and he comes upon a tree. Now, all the lower leaves are eaten by all the other giraffes, antelope, rabbits, whatever, and he wants to eat the leaves at the top of the tree. He would have an environmental pressure for his neck to grow so he could reach those leaves. So over his lifetime, his neck would start growing and growing and growing. Might grow an inch or 2. And then he would pass that change on to his child, and his children would still have the same pressure. Their necks would grow and grow and grow, and eventually you have giraffes with really long necks so that they can reach those leaves at the top of the tree. To go back to the iPhone analogy, think of your autocorrect. iPhones have a pressure from you to try to understand what you're trying to communicate. It starts to learn your raffle mouths and lulls, and eventually it builds up a dictionary of your diction. And when your phone breaks, and you've backed it up obviously, and you move your autocorrect from your old phone to your new phone, those changes continue and continue. Over time, big changes happen. No one has any clue what you're saying except your iPhone. And this ability to pass on differences from individual to individual can be likened to the modern epigenetics. In a recent study, Cox spoke of Waddington, who first defined epigenetics. Epi means above and genetics means genetics, and together it basically means that the environment can affect gene expression. Such as in this image, they illustrated that the curves show the effects of a person's genes, but external factors can affect what specific behaviors develop. This term is a relatively new part of psychological study because it was recently discovered that the environmental changes could be passed on to offspring. As mentioned, this is not because of a change of genes, but as a change of gene expression. Imagine you have your hair in a certain style and you take a selfie. There is one expression of that hair. Now imagine you mess up your hair and you take another selfie. There is another different expression of the hair, but it's the same hair. So epigenetics is not a change in genes, but the change of the gene expression. In a more scientific example, because science, Natio found that mothers exposed to stress had male offspring who performed worse on water maze tasks. So stress given to the mother impaired their children's ability. So theoretically, it's not only your parents' genes that affect you, it's your parents' experiences as well. So if you're bad at swimming, blame your parents. So that's really all similar to Lamarckian evolution. But in the same study, Cox talked about Haeckel's recapitulation theory. This theory proposes that development coincides with evolution. So as you're growing up, you're growing through all the previous stages of your ancestors. Something quite like Pokemon. Charmander, arguably the best Pokemon, despite being a walking fire hazard, started life in his simplest form. And as he gained experience and developed, he eventually grew into the much more complex Charizard. To bring this example back to the human side of things, by theory, as humans grow, they're growing through all their previous ancestors. And it has actually been shown that humans' baby skulls are very similar to other primates' baby skulls, and they only diverge as we grow. Now, contrary to Lamarck and Haeckel was Darwin with his natural selection. In Grant's 1991 article, he talks about Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin was on a boat in the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that, dependent on what foods finches ate, they had different beak sizes. And so after he studied this extensively, and he studied sloths and other things, he wrote The Origin of Species. The Origin of Species proposed that those individuals who were most suited for the environment would survive and pass on their genes. Over time, these small differences in the genes would be exacerbated and you would get large changes in adaptations in species. And although we generally think of natural selection as things becoming harder, better, faster, stronger, and anything else in Daft Punk's vocabulary, there's actually 3 types of selection. The most commonly thought of type of selection is directional selection, things becoming more extreme. Small animals could hide from predators, and thus there would be selection for genes that make the species small. Large animals could fight off the predators, and thus there would be a selection for genes that make the species large. Both of these examples show a trait caused by a gene that helps the species survive, and thus pass on their genes to their offspring. But sometimes neither of the extremes are better. Sometimes the most average individuals will survive the best. This is an example of stabilizing selection. Imagine there is a person, and they are scared of nothing, so they try to fly by jumping off a building. Now that they're dead, they can't reproduce, so they can't pass on their genes, so their fearlessness gene is stopped. On the other side, imagine someone who is scared of everything. They're so scared they never have sex. And since they never have sex, they can't pass on their genes. And since they can't pass on those genes that made them have high anxiety get selected out. So the fearless person and their fearful person gets selected out, and you have an average amount of fear. On the other side, there's disruptive selection, where both these individuals prosper and move into different directions. This is kind of like directional selection, but instead of the genes moving simply towards one direction, they're moving in both different directions at the same time. This is how you get speciation, the creation of new species. When 2 different genes get selected for in opposite directions, eventually those 2 species can't reproduce with each other, and then there's now 2 different species. A more immediate type of selection is artificial selection. In his 2013 article, Otto Drenz talked about how artificial selection had caused a massive change in one particular species. Dogs. All dogs are descended and artificially selected from wolves. From border collies who have been selected to herd sheep, to bloodhounds who have been selected to track people, to chihuahuas who have been selected to fit in Paris Hilton's purse. They have all been artificially selected for certain traits. But since they can all still reproduce with each other, they're still all the same species. So after Darwin proposed natural selection, there was some problems. So to fix these problems, he came up with sexual selection. In a 1990 article, Alan Moore talked about Darwin's 2 types of sexual selection: intersexual selection and intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is a type of selection that occurs primarily between males, and it is them competing with each other for access to females. Intersexual selection, on the other hand, is found primarily in females, and is whereby the females choose which males they want to mate with. Which brings me on to probably the most obvious point of this video, that evolution leads to adaptations. Adaptations, as defined by Buss, are inherited and reliably developing characteristics from evolution in an ancestral environment being complex, economic, efficient, reliable, functional, and precise. Basically, ignoring the majority of words I just said, adaptations are caused by environmental pressures that cause directional selection. This directional selection can cause the creation of new traits. But with adaptations come byproducts and noise. Byproducts are characteristics that aren't functional, but they came with the adaptation. For example, a byproduct is that bones are white. This is a byproduct of an adaptation of bones having calcium for strength. In Breaking Bad, Walter White's meth is blue, not because he tried to make it blue, but because it is a byproduct of a new recipe. Noise is simply random mutations that get passed on from generation to generation. For example, when Jesse Pinkman admired the size of Walter's meth rocks, they could have been broken any way, but it was by random chance that they broke that certain way. It's a characteristic that comes from randomness. So that kind of wraps up an introduction of evolutionary psychology. And a lot of people don't like evolutionary psychology. Many people don't like it because it seems to imply things that would enhance stereotypes or cause inequality. A major point in this argument against evolutionary psychology is eugenics, and understandably so, it's not a good thing. It is important, therefore, to remember that evolutionary psychology has two facets that have to be considered. First, that results work on averages. They are not representative of every case. Just because females are shown to be better at males in a certain case, or vice versa, does not mean that they're better than males in every single case, or vice versa. It is just on average, taking into consideration every single case, that the females outperform the males. Secondly, it is important to note that adaptations may no longer be useful. People will often try to point at modern reasons for people to do things they do, and sometimes those reasons came from when we were hunter-gatherers or even before that. For example, in an article by Nichols, he spoke about how schizophrenia could be the result of Stephen and Price's group splitting hypothesis. When a hunter and gatherer group got too big, above roughly 150 people, it would split into two different groups. And generally, schizophrenics could make really good leaders. Their tendency to overreact to possible threats could cause hypervigilance without the group and therefore cause the group to survive better. Many modern theorists have proposed that schizophrenia is actually due to a byproduct of an adaptation, but regardless, this hypothesis exemplifies an adaptation that may have used to be useful, but it's no longer useful. So in conclusion, we have to remember that evolutionary psychology works on averages, and also our adaptations may no longer be useful. But evolutionary psychology does offer us a glimpse into our past, and it can help us explain why we have the behaviors we do today. I think that's why it's important to start off any topic of psychology with evolutionary psychology. For part 2, click the link in the description because annotations confuse me. The references can also be found down in the description. They're in a Google Doc because YouTube doesn't like me.